Hey guys, what is up? Super K-Man Rocks here, and we are here for my LCK week number 1 overview and analysis video here in the LCK Cup, the winter split, whatever you want to call it. We have gone over the primer, we have gone over all 10 teams in terms of my expectations. You can of course check that video out up in the iCard, and you can check out all of the other primer videos up in the iCard as well if you are interested in that. But now we finally get to jump into some actual LCK action, official LCK action. No Kespa Cup stuff, no preseason tournament stuff. This is genuinely just the teams going at it and seeing who is going to be able to try and make sense of this dynamic format. Spoiler alert for the rest of this video. I'm usually not one to pat myself on the back too early in videos, but boy howdy did we do a pretty good job on the primer this year. In fact, I would dare say that we did better than basically any analyst that you will find anywhere else on the internet. So stay tuned to see why I believe that and where I think I ended up getting a lot of things right when it came to the LCK in particular. But that's going to be saved for the rest of the video. If you are new here, what we are going to do in today's video is go series by series from all of the week 1 series, all 10 of them, across all 5 days, talking about the advantages and the disadvantages that each team was able to generate. I'll be giving a player of the series and a dud of the series for each individual series that we cover, and at the end of the week, I will be giving a player of the week and a dud of the week to tie everything into a nice, neat little bow. We will be updating my personal power rankings, and of course, talking about the group standings at the end, with Baron and Elder kind of fighting it out to see who's going to be winners group. We're going to be talking about the potential playoff seeds moving into the second half. It's a very weird format, and I'll try to make sense of it as we go further along, because I do think that there are just some, weird things about it. The top 3 teams are not always going to be the 3 teams with the best record that end up getting into that second stage. So, well, again, we'll talk about that when we get there, but for now, let's go ahead and start talking about these series. We're going to be going day by day, and that means starting with day number 1, and we did kick off the LCK season, the LCK year, with an appropriately very interesting matchup. The LCK never starts with the lead. They never start with the big one. They always start with something a little bit weird, and that was definitely the case here in 2025, because the first series was a matchup between OK BRION and DRX. Remember, every single matchup is going to be between Baron and Elder, one team from Baron, one team from Group Elder, and you'll denote that with the middle section in the screen. The B and the E will just denote which side each of these teams is on, which group each of these teams is on. But in our first series, DRX is going to be able to take down the reigning defending Kespa Cup champions, and this is kind of what I was expecting. I was genuinely shocked to see so many people so low on DRX, not because I think that this roster is dominant across the board, but because UCal is really, really good. I think a lot of people just didn't expect his skill set to translate nearly as well from the LPL and like what he's been doing in the past couple of years back to the LCK, where he really struggled the last time he played. I'm sorry, like anybody who watched UCal over the past 2 years or so knows how dominant this guy is. He is a lot closer, I would say, to being Showmaker or BDD than he is to being Closer, his lane opponent in this matchup, and he definitely showed that off here. He was excellent, and he is going to get player of the series for me in this first series. This guy is just unbelievably talented. He's super consistent. He doesn't really make any sort of mistakes. The reason he was so good in the LPL is because he does have that switch that he can flip, that he can just kind of turn on whenever he needs to, that gets him into this position where he can carry. But outside of that, when he doesn't feel like he needs to be like the number 1 option 24/7, when he doesn't feel like he needs to dominate, he is so consistently safe, and he's always just making the perfect mid-ground play. Like, he is exactly what you want out of a mid laner at this level. Somebody who is going to be a team player for the most part, but if he needs to be the number 1 option, if he needs to be the carry, he can do that. And that's why I actually think DRX is going to be just fine. I don't think they're going to be a good team, because I do think they have too many weaknesses, but UCal is simply too good for this team to not be competitive in some facet. He was dragging the corpse of Thunder Talk across the finish line the past couple of years, and I think that might be the same here for DRX. But the other big thing here, no Teddy. He is out with illness. He was not able to play in week number 1, but Lazyfield comes in, breaks the seal, is finally the first ever non-Korean player to play in the LCK, if you're not counting like 2012 and before, the early times of the LCK. Lazyfield is the first non-Korean resident to actively play in the league, and you know what? He came in and was excellent. He was better than what I've seen out of Teddy over the last few splits. It's crazy. I know I'm low on Teddy. I know I don't necessarily have the same kind of opinion that a lot of the other like people in the community and general analysts do or have on Teddy, but This guy was crazy cracked. Like, DRX has a really good track record of producing, decent LCK talent out of that bot lane position. It's not always 100%. Look at someone like Taiyun. But their challengers and their academy system, and, even going further than that, they've always produced relatively okay talent, and LazyField just feels like another kind of option in that regard, kind of similar to what we were talking about with someone like Paddock a couple of years ago. He was really solid, aggressive. He's very much willing to step up and try and win trades. I think him and Ondel had pretty good synergy. Ondel always plays well at the start of every single split, and so I think that definitely helped, but I was very impressed with LazyField's mechanics, and I do think that that is something that can translate and can continue to be useful as they play through. We'll see if he ends up staying in the starting lineup. Obviously, he's in for the rest of week number 1. We don't really know what the case is with Teddy or how long he's going to be out. I imagine he'll be back in, but certainly something to keep an eye on. The other player that I think was really good for DRX in this series was Rich in the top lane. I had some questions about Rich and whether or not he was going to be able to translate his skill set back to the LCK. It really felt like he took advantage, I think, of North America's slower style when he was on Dignitas to really succeed in that region. And obviously, the last time we saw him in the LCK, his team was successful, but he didn't exactly have a great run of things, individually when he was on Nongshim back in the day. And, I was worried that that was going to be something similar here, that his laning phases were going to be awful and he was just going to get destroyed in 1v1s, especially when he didn't have counterpick. And, the team fights were still going to be good, but he wasn't going to be able to survive. Well, he survived laning phases in this series and was able to make gigantic impacts in the back half, and that's kind of the dream for someone like Rich. The Gragas game in particular in game number 3 was genuinely excellent. He probably was the player of the game in game number 3. I just think UCal was more important throughout the entirety of the series when you're talking about the Aurora game in game 2 and, still being very relevant on the Ambessa in game number 3. But Rich was really, really solid, and you do have to give him a big shout there. I'm still worried about Sponge. Ondel looks really good at the beginning of every split, but he typically starts to trail off a bit as you play more and more and more. I'm not expecting DRX to be world beaters. I'm not expecting them to be a team that ends up like near top 3 in terms of this group. That would be a bit of a surprise to me, but they are certainly a team that has a lot more going for them than I think a lot of people in the community are going to give them credit for, just because UCal is that strong. And then for Bro on the other side, another one of my takes from the primer that I think I feel really good about right now, which is that the Kespa Cup was just not a repeatable performance, in my opinion. I'm very concerned about a lot of rookies coming into an LCK team and just being expected to carry a large burden for that team. Everybody in the comments was like, you're underrating Hanwha, you're underrating Hype. I'm not underrating their potential. I know what they can turn into. These guys are excellent. They are arguably the 2 single best prospects in Korea right now. I would put Zinni in that list. I think Siwoo, obviously, throughout this week kind of proved that he is in that conversation as well, but these guys are genuinely like legit great prospects. It's just so hard to go into the LCK and be good. We've seen this over and over and over again, regardless of how good someone is in LCK Challengers League. The first couple of weeks, the first couple of months in the LCK are always hard. The transition, the difficulty of going from tier 2 to tier 1 in Korea is harder than any other region in the world, and every year it feels like a lot of people are like, well, this player is the one that's different. This player is the one that's going to be able to break that. And it just doesn't really happen. They struggle a lot early. Now, things weren't awful, I would say, for Bro. They won game number 1, and they looked pretty good in that first game, but they just weren't able to find any sort of consistency. Hanwha is going to get my dud of the series here. I just was not impressed. The Viego game in game 2, the Brand game in game 3 was constantly getting caught out, not really in great spots. It just seems like he needs some time to adapt. We know how mechanically talented he is, but he's going to need to be able to get more comfortable playing at the LCK level, and, that's just kind of what you would expect. Sponge is the kind of player that he should be taking advantage of, that he kind of has to be better than from day one, and, while he may have been better at times, like Sponge wasn't exactly perfect in this series, like he wasn't abusing that matchup by any means. It certainly wasn't a situation where he was getting the rest of his team fed because he was the better jungler. It kind of felt more neutral than anything else, and that's not really a great sign going up against a player who was inarguably the worst jungler in the league last year. So certainly something to keep in mind. Hype was fine. I think if you're looking for a positive, Hype was definitely a positive. Polu, I think, was good outside of that third game on Nautilus where he definitely had some struggles, but the Rel in game 1 was truly excellent. I think Morgan and Closer were generally whatever. I'm still super out on Closer. I think this guy is just not as good as a lot of the other middle tier mid laners. Like, I think he's near the bottom of, like, the, if you want to put UCal in the middle tier mid laners, I think that that's fair. He's, like, the upper middle tier. He's just below that, like, A tier in terms of what you're talking about. But, UCal, I think, is at the top of that. I think someone like Bulldog is probably a little bit better than Closer at the current moment. I just think this player continues to be a bit overrated because he's been on good teams in the past. He's not really been a huge reason why those teams are good, and I think we continue to see that when he is facing consistently good talent like UCal. But, outside of that, Bro is Bro. This is a team that they absolutely should have beaten, especially if they were as real as the Kespa Cup would indicate, but as my hesitation showed in my primer, I think I was right to be a little bit more tepid about what they were going to be at the beginning of the year. Great win for DRX though. UCal looks excellent, and if they are going to win games, it's 100% going to be through him. We'll see what happens with Lazy Field, because I really did like the debut here from him, but there still are holes on this roster. Beating Bro is not exactly the most gigantic win in the entire universe. DRX still has a bit of a ways to go before they feel like a comfortable team that's definitely going to be in a great spot moving into spring. But then moving on now to our second series of day number 1, and I was really excited to see where the series ended up going, because I think these two teams are actually in pretty similar spots. It was the DN Freecs taking on NS RedForce, and DNF does end up picking up the 2-0, or 2-1, I should say, series win here after dropping game number 2. They looked like the better team, though, I would say pretty much across the board, with the exception of one role, which you can see on your screen and we will get into. Also, one thing I didn't talk about at the beginning of this video that I am curious to know you guys' thoughts on are the backgrounds that we have, the team flags in the background instead of the gradients that we normally have for a lot of the other regions. We're just trying some new stuff out. Let me know if you like it or if you don't like it down in the comments below. Let me know if it's too busy, too distracting, or if you think it's a good touch to kind of see the logo behind these teams that, you know, ended up winning the game. If you preferred the gradients, if you preferred the color schemes, you know, just let me know that down in the comments, and, you know, we can work something out in that direction. You know, also let me know if you like the LPL format from the previous day. We're just trying a bunch of stuff out on the channel to make these graphics a little bit more interesting. But into the game itself, like into this series itself, this was a really easy one for me to talk about, because a lot of the things that went right in this series were things that I expected to go right and talked about going right in my primer, and a lot of the things that went wrong, even for DNF, were things that I kind of expected to go wrong, that I'm really not surprised to see like not work out in the best of ways. So let's go ahead and get into it. Player of this series is very easily going to go to Berserker here in the bot lane. I don't know why people were expecting Berserker to be bad. Like, you heard a lot of the analysts on the LCK itself talking about how it was going to be a rough transition for Berserker, about how it was going to be difficult. Again, I just think a lot of people don't watch, like, a lot of the other regions. A lot of the LCK analysts just don't really watch the LPL or the LCS over the past couple of years, or even Worlds, right? Because Berserker, yes, he's been playing in North America, and it's a different level of competition, and he did struggle a bit last year because he was mentally checked out, but go watch what this guy looked like in North America, like, last year. 2023 especially. Like, the difference wasn't just, oh, he's the best player in NA, and, you know, he's gonna be a really good, you know, he's hopefully going to be able to get some of that talent into the LCK after the transition. You know, it wasn't that. It was, this guy is so much better than everybody in North America. Like, he is by far the most talented player that maybe NA has ever seen, that coming over to the LCK, the expectation for me was that he should be on a top 3 or top 4 team basically immediately. Like, he is that kind of talent, a borderline top 20 player in the world kind of talent when everything is going right, and he showed that off here. This dude is just absolutely cracked. The Ashe game, obviously, in game number 3 is what a lot of people are going to point to, but he was just really good throughout the entirety of the series, and I think the most encouraging thing for me is how good his synergy was with Life in the support position. They played awesome as a 2v2, and it really looked like they were, you know, coherent, and they knew exactly where they wanted to be on the map at any point in time. I just loved the way that they played together, and Life was another player that everybody was just underrating because he wasn't very good in the LCK 2 years ago when he left, but he was really good in the LPL last year. He was really good in the LCK before 2023 as well, and, you know, I'm not surprised to see him come back and have another really good series. Berserker and Life looked great as a bot lane duo, and hopefully that can keep up. The other player, obviously, to talk about in terms of, like, player of the series potential was Dudu in the top lane, who, once again, was excellent. I'm expecting a gigantic year from him. This guy is way too talented to sit here on the best team he's ever played for in his entire career and not have a breakout year. You know, Kingan's a good player. He's a stable weak side top laner. He's, like, a top 4 top laner, somewhere in that range. Like, you know what you're going to get out of him. You're not worried about him, former world champion, etc., etc. Dudu just completely outclassed him in basically every single way. This was not a close top lane matchup, and that has a lot to do, I think, with how good Dudu is in the top lane for DNF, not so much that Kingan is awful. I just was super impressed. Bulldog was really good as well. I think he's really cementing himself as that, you know, weak side mid laner. I know it's a weird thing to talk about, but that shove and roam mid that wants to play for the other lanes. We talked about it in the primer. It's basically the role that he has adopted at this point, but Fisher not exactly going to put up a ton of resistance in that regard. Dud of the series, though, is actually staying on the winning side, and this isn't something that I do often if you're new to the channel. This is very rare, but I do think Pioshik was the worst player in this series. I think he got got mega out-jungled by Gideon. It just didn't end up mattering because nobody else on the team was actually strong enough to be able to take advantage of it. Maybe Jiwoo had a bit of a gold advantage at times, but I mean, Berserker was also incredibly strong in a lot of these situations, but Gideon was excellent, easily the best player on the Rift for Nongshim, and that's a really good sign for them. We'll get to that in a second, but Pyosik, just way too flippy for me. Like, he really was just outclassed, and I do think that that's something that he's going to have to, you know, pick up on. You're not going to change Pyosik. You know exactly who he is at this point. He's the kind of player that on any given day can be the single worst player in the LCK, and on any given day can be the single best player in the LCK. He just rolled a bit low here. Lucky for him, and I think the most encouraging thing, a lot of Pyosik teams in the past have relied on Pyosik winning in order for them to win because, you know, his bad games typically bring down the rest of the team. His bad game was okay bad. Like, it was like justifiably bad. He just wasn't making good decisions and was getting caught out in bad situations, but the team was good enough to be able to rally around, you know, someone like Berserker and someone like Dudu instead and be able to win anyways, and I think that's incredibly encouraging for their success chance moving forward. So really great first series for DNF, and an okay first series, I would say, for Nongshim. Certainly not one that I'm freaking out about. I think, like I said, Gideon was really good here, and I think he did do a lot of, you know, really strong things, especially on the Nidalee in game number 3 to try to keep them in it. I thought he was really good on the Xin Zhao. In game number 2 was, in my opinion, very clearly the best player for Nongshim in this series. He already showed a lot of growth on Bro last year when he was playing in the Spring Split. It's nice to see that that has carried over, and, you know, with a team with Lehens and Kingen, it's nice to see that Gideon is actually the one that's starting to kind of make a name for himself, because jungle mid was supposed to be the one lane or one part of the map that was the big weakness for Nongshim. I think Jiwoo and Lehens were also fine. Lehens was a bit too far forward at times, but you kind of have to live with that, especially like Lehens' KDAs aren't going to look nearly as good as they did on Gen.G, but I still think he was impactful, and Jiwoo was alive in this series. It was the solo laners that I think really let this team down. Fisher's just not really that good, and he doesn't really trust himself to be aggressive. Bulldog was allowed to do whatever he wanted across this entire series because Fisher just never felt like he was going to match him. And then Kingen probably would have gotten done of the series if it weren't for Pyosik not being particularly good on the other side of this. Kingen just didn't do anything on the top side, and Dudu was better in lane. He was better out of lane. Like, he just kind of got completely outclassed here in this first series. He's going to have to be better moving forward. He was one of their big off-season acquisitions. He's not going to get away with playing like this, but Gideon playing well, and I think, you know, the bot lane having some life is certainly something interesting. Mid lane still continues to look like a black hole for this organization, but getting a win over DNF, you know, one game win, it's not really that bad, and they're going to have an easier matchup later on in the week. But for DNF, this is genuinely a good team. There was a reason I had this team ranked in my top 5. I think it's reasonable to expect that, you know, a couple of advancements later, a really big hot streak in the playoffs, this team could absolutely make an international tournament this year, including Worlds, and a lot of that has to do with how much I trust Berserker and how good he looked in this first series, how good his chemistry was with Life. If that's going to be able to keep up, DNF is genuinely going to be one of the scarier teams in the LCK. But then moving on now to day number 2, and again, we had a pretty predictable outcome, not a lot of the more intense games happening early on in the week. It was BNK FearX taking on KT Rolster, and KT is going to pick up the 2-1 series win. It would have been a pretty big upset if BFX had picked up a victory here. They do get the win in game 2, which I think is really encouraging, and I think there are some things about, you know, how BFX ended up playing, or I guess one player that did end up impressing me in this one, but KT was better basically across the board. Not really a lot to complain about when it came to them. There are minor things that I think you could nitpick when it came to KT in this series, but at the end of the day, they were just so much more talented than BFX on the other side that it never really felt like it was going to be all that up for a debate or all that difficult for them to end up winning. BDD is a very easy choice for player of the series. You know, I knew I was going to get backlash for putting BDD as the number 5 mid laner in the LCK in my primer. I continue to believe that he is somewhere in the range of 3 to 5. I think 3, 4, and 5 are the same, you know, talent level. Like Zeka, Showmaker, BDD, they're all really close in terms of what they are as players. They're all incredibly good mid laners, and I think you could realistically have them in any order. Hell, you could put Faker at 5, and I would honestly kind of agree with you at the current moment in terms of how he played towards the end of the LCK year last year, but BDD is still going to be able to dominate all of the bottom tier mid laners. Like that's the problem in the LCK right now, is that if you don't have a mid laner that can compete with BDD and Showmaker and Zeka and Faker regularly, and Chovy obviously regularly, then you just can't really be all that competitive of a team. You need a mid laner that can at the very least survive at the top level, and the bottom teams just don't have that. We'll talk about that with Vikla, but it's just so obvious when you see the good mid laners play the bad mid laners in the LCK, or the good mid laners play the the average mid laners, I should say, in the LCK, because they win harder than any other role, and BDD absolutely did that. He's still phenomenal on his ear. Who could have possibly seen that coming? But the Yone was really good as well in game number 1. He just was the best player in this series, and he is the main character for KT Rolster. If he's able to carry that form that he had towards the end of 2024 into 2025, he's going to be just fine. He's going to be an MVP frontrunner, like he would have been if he played the last 4 weeks of or if he played the entire year like he did the last 4 weeks of the regular season in 2024. I think the other big positive for me was actually Dectum here, and Dectum and Wei in particular as a duo. There were some mistakes. He certainly wasn't perfect. The Caitlyn game, it definitely had some ups and downs, but I would say the Jinx, the Ashe, like this is what Deft was for this team last year in 2024. I just think Dectum could actually be a little bit more consistent about it. You know, Deft definitely has a higher mechanical ceiling. He's just a better player when he's asked to be the main character of the team, but if BDD is going to be taking a more dominant role in the mid lane like he did towards the end of last year when they were more successful, you know, Dectum being the kind of guy that you can just give no resources to and have him be relevant, I think is a big positive. And Wei, I thought, was really good in this series, especially on the Lulu in game number 3. I want to see more enchanters. They're so strong right now. I know people don't like playing them. I know that they are boring to a lot of support players, but they're so good, and I think they are so effective, especially in this hyper carry ADC meta. If you're going to pick something like Jinx, Zeri, you know, whatever, right? Like, I think enchanters can be really good in that regard. So Dectum, Wei, looking really solid. You know, Perfect had a couple of good moments, couple of bad moments. I think generally I'm still really in on Perfect, and he was definitely better than Clear on the other side of this. I just think he's so talented. I think if you can get the most out of him, you're looking at a player that's around what like Dudu or Kingin is as a top laner, like a borderline top 3, top 4 kind of guy. Cuz was a little bit more shaky, I would say. Definitely not like a dominant start here for Cuz, but he's never started splits incredibly hot. It's kind of the opposite of what we talked about with someone like Ondil for DRX, where he always starts the season hot and then kind of trails off a bit. Cuz, you know, definitely kind of trails up, I think, as splits go along. Hopefully that's going to be the same here, especially with BDD playing so well. But it's KT beating BFX. This is the result you would have expected. Maybe you would have hoped it was going to be 2 games instead of 3, but at the end of the day, you know, picking up the win in the way that they did, I'm certainly not going to be frustrated by it. And for BFX, I feel pretty spot on with my number 10 ranking. This looked like the worst team in the league in terms of how they ended up playing this out. The one big positive, I think, is Diablo in the bot lane, who actually looked pretty okay in this series, was super aggressive. Actually reminded me a ton of when Paddock came up and played for DRX and just kind of was like, screw it, this team is bad. He replaced Dectum, ironically enough, but it's like, screw it, this team is bad. I'm just going to go and try and do whatever I can. Like, he doesn't have the highest mechanical ceiling in the world, but the aggression is just going to naturally get you more advantages than, you know, playing a little bit more passively like Dectum did, especially if you don't have the rest of the team around you playing all that well. But outside of that, there really isn't a ton to love about how BFX ended up playing this. I think when you're looking at dud of the series, it's really just about whether or not you think game 1 or game 3 was worse. For BFX, game 1's dud of the game was Kellen, and game 3's dud of the game was Vikla. And so whichever one you really want to give that title to, I think is fair. I'm going to give it to Vikla. I thought the Akali in game 3 was the worst game played by BFX, but if you wanted to give it to Kellen for that game 1 on the Leona, I think that's also entirely fair. Neither of them played well here. Not entirely surprised by either of those outcomes. Vikla, obviously a player that is just not on the level of a BDD or a Showmaker, and we talk about it all the time. I already said it. When you're a top 5 mid laner, you're just going to destroy everybody else in the league. That's why it's so important to find that position, and Vikla just doesn't really feel like he's going to be able to live up to that position. It was a big reason why BFX came in at number 10 for me in my rankings, you know, alongside the fact that I didn't love Diablo as a promotion, but some people might be, you know, a little annoyed to hear me go, I expected Kellen to be bad in this circumstance, but remember, like, I still ranked him relatively fine. Like, he came in as, I think, my number 5 support in the region. I still think he's undervalued, but it's impossible to look good as a support in games and in series like this. Like, his KDAs are just going to suck. He's going to be making some bad plays. There are good supports that have been on bad teams that have looked horrible. I think it's going to be very similar to what Lehens looks like, except I don't think Kellen has the mechanical ceiling of Lehens to have those gigantic pop-off moments. Like, as much as I like Kellen, he's not the kind of player that can be somebody that looks good on a bad team. It's just not really the play style. And even with Diablo looking good, I think they might even have opposite styles. Kellen definitely likes to play a little bit slower in terms of how he wants to go about laning phase, and Diablo definitely looks mega aggressive, at least in terms of how he played this first series. Clear got outplayed in the top side. Raptor looked horrible on the Jarvan. Not nearly as bad as Vikla on the Akali, but certainly like not great. Jarvan looked very weak in that game. BFX just looks outclassed at this level. It's nice that they won game number 2, and maybe I'm undervaluing game number 2 and just, you know, kind of looking over it, but games 1 and 3 were just so dominant and they looked so lost in terms of how they played those that I expect that to kind of be what they look like for a majority of the rest of the split. And then for KT, you know, good for them. Like, they beat BFX. This is a free win, I think, for a lot of teams on the side of Elder. It was a big reason why I thought Elder was clearly the group to beat. In terms of, you know, what you were talking about, that Elder was clearly the one that should be favorited here, is because I think BFX is just going to lose a lot of games, and KT got the job done. Maybe you would have liked the 2-1. Maybe that would have been nice, but BDD looks excellent. I think Dectum and Wei seem like they have something under control, and Perfect continues to grow. This can still be a very good team, but definitely more to prove at the end of the week. But then moving to our second series of day number 2, and finally, we've got some teams that are LCK title contenders going head-to-head. It's Dplus KIA taking on T1. And Dplus KIA is maybe shockingly going to pick up that 2-1 series win. This is, you know, kind of an upset, and I certainly think this is an upset at the end of the day. I don't think T1 expected to come in here and just kind of get outplayed, but you know what? DK might actually be back. This was a really, really great showing from them. I'm not going to try to overreact to one best of 3 because I think that there are a lot of things that can go wrong on one day in one best of 3, but this was a really good performance from Dplus KIA. T1 had their own individual struggles, but for the most part, DK just did a really good job of capitalizing on the things that they individually do really well, and I think you could point to all 5 players making gigantic impacts for them as a team. So I'll go ahead and get into it. Player of the series was difficult because I do think everybody played well. I very much wanted to give this to Lucid in the jungle, and I very much considered giving it to Lucid in the jungle because I really think he was that good, but I have to give it to Beryl in the support position, not only obviously because it's clear that he came in and made a real impact on their macro and on their ability to play the map, very similar to what I talked about when they had Kellen in, but Beryl just seemed a lot more focused and a lot better in terms of his mechanics, but his mechanics were really good. Like, he was making impactful plays on Leona, on Braum. Like, it wasn't just this theoretical impact that we hear about all the time when it comes to Beryl, where it's like, oh, but he might not be playing well, but he adds a lot of mental factor or whatever to the game. You know, that's a theoretical advantage that I can't quantify by watching it. I can quantify how good Beryl was in this series, which is a really good thing. Now, do I think that this is going to be super sustainable for Beryl? I think there's a lot of reason to believe that it is. First off, the last time we saw him in this organization, obviously he was consistent and he was really good. He really only got super inconsistent once he left Damwon in 2022, but there is something to be said about how Beryl basically always steps up against T1 and about how especially he plays well against KIA. It's always been a really good matchup for Beryl, and even when he's been on teams like DRX and like KT in the past, when he's been inconsistent in those stops, he's been really good against T1. It's just kind of always been something that has looked good for Beryl. We'll see what ends up happening as we continue on throughout the weeks, but again, I'm not ruling out Beryl like re-breaking out and having a really consistent split here and being the best support in the region again, purely just from getting him back into an organization that's probably going to force him to take it a lot more seriously. Really, the only issues that Beryl has had has been like lapses in judgment and concentration in the middle of the regular season, where there's clearly just stretches of time where he's not completely committed to playing games, and as long as you're able to fix that and able to lock that up, which I think DK has shown like a really good track record of doing for a lot of players, then I think he's going to be awesome, and hopefully he can get back to that best support in the world kind of conversation. But I really do not want to undersell how good Lucid was in this series. He just completely outplayed Owner, basically from start to finish. The Nidalee was excellent. The Vi was even better, being able to create opportunities over and over again for Showmaker to be able to follow up on with the Ahri, like this pick comp to be able to set up the Jinx to carry late game. It's just a really good idea for how DK like to play. I know people give me shit for how much I, you know, kind of shit on aiming individually as a player and how I think he is a bit overrated, but this is the exact kind of way to play around a player like aiming who is so scared and passive in the early game. Give him a hyper carry, give him Jinx, and let the rest of the team just set him up over and over and over again. This is what DK did so well last year, was put aiming in a position where basically any AD carry could pop off in those spots. This was a very similar series in my opinion. I know the broadcast gave player of the series to aiming, but I think any AD carry could have done really well in this spot with Showmaker really setting up the team perfectly. You know, not so much on the Xerath in game number 2, but we're going to ignore that. And Lucid being awesome, I think that, you know, it just makes your job a lot easier as a bot laner, as an AD carry player. As for a debut, Siwoo was good and bad. I think when you're looking at game number 1, he looked excellent on the Ambessa, and generally in team fights, he was amazing. He was really good at playing these 5v5s and linking up with players like Showmaker to be able to create for them. The laning phase was a little bit more up in the air. I mean, I think a lot of people are going to forget that in game 3, Doran had like a 4K gold lead or something ridiculous on the Jax against the Sion. I know that matchup is pretty difficult overall for Sion, but, you know, Siwoo probably needs to learn how to lose a little bit less hard in terms of the 1v1. Outside of that, though, again, again, the big impactful moments later on in games, he definitely was still making a real impact. But everybody on DK kind of pulling their own weight, I would say, in Series 1 here. And to start 1-0 against T1, like, this is a disaster for Group Baron. There are a lot of things to be said about how, every other analyst said that Group Baron was better, and I was basically the only one that was talking about how Group Elder was the one I expected to be winner's group. This makes it very difficult for Baron, because now you've kind of put yourself into a pretty deep hole. But for T1, I don't really know what happened here. I'm not going to sit here and say I don't expect this team to ever underperform, because golly, go watch them last year. The regular season wasn't very good in the summer split. This team is so regularly being a 500 team that seeing that happen in situations where it's not quite as impactful in these best of threes that are quote unquote like regular season oriented, it's not a surprise to see them in that circumstance. But they didn't play well really at all in this series. I think you can point to two players in particular, Owner and Faker. Mid jungle just wasn't good. Faker was awful in game 3 on the Azir, I should say. But Owner was worse. I think he is going to get the dud of the series. Just got completely out-jungled by Lucid. Wasn't nearly as effective on the other side. We've seen jungle actually matter quite a bit so far in this meta. Bad junglers are getting punished much more heavily than they have been before, or at least junglers that are more aggressive are getting punished a lot more than they were before, because you're basically forced to skirmish a lot more. And that means that these situations that you fall into where you don't really have a lot of prio and you can't really contest a lot of the enemy jungler, it just makes you look even worse. And I don't think Owner was particularly good in this opening matchup. KIA also really struggled, I would say, in this series. Guma had a really poor game number 3 on the Jhin, but outside of that was fine. And Doran, I think, is going to get a lot more shit for this, because he comes into T1 and he's the only new addition, and now they're losing to Dplus KIA, who they weren't really struggling with in previous years. But I don't think he was the issue. Again, you want to talk about the Jax not having any impact even with that gigantic gold lead in game number 3. I think that's a fair thing to talk about. But look at the comp on DK. What is Jax actually supposed to do in the late game here? He can't split push because the Scion can just catch waves for free. He's going to get picked off here very easily by Vi or by Ahri, who can just kind of go through a lot of the problems that Jax has as a champion to be able to just kill him. Like, I don't really know what Doran was supposed to do in game number 3. So overall, I just think T1 needs to figure some things out. I think they're going to continue to struggle in the regular season against great teams unless they can really adapt to this meta a bit better. But this was definitely an upset. You never really know what to talk about when it comes to T1, because you never really know where they land in terms of their expectations. They are never a team that I'm going to be like, they're completely done after seeing a bad regular season performance. But for DK on the other side, all 5 members looking good is about as good of a start as you could possibly ask for. Beating T1, the defending world champions, is about as good of a start as you could ask for. And especially like the young players looking great, Siwoo and Lucid, like looking really strong, even with Showmaker also looking really good. Like, DK might actually be a world's favorite this year if everything were to go right, and that's a crazy thing to say. But then moving on now to our middle day number 3, and we get a matchup between the projected 2 best teams in the league and a finals rematch from summer that ended up being the biggest blowout of the entire week. It's Gen.G taking on Hanwha Life, and Gen.G obliterated Hanwha Life. This series was not even remotely close. I was really surprised to see that a majority of people expected HLE to be like the favorites coming into the year. I think they saw the Zeus, upgrade, quote unquote, in the top lane and just said like, oh, that means they're instantly going to be the best team. I don't know what's going on with people's perception of Ruler. I don't know if nobody watches the LPL or if people just look at the standings and see that Ruler missed Worlds and they assume that he's fallen off and that he's gotten worse or whatever. Like, this guy is still arguably the best AD carry in the entire world, and he proved that once again here. He manhandled Hanwha Life. Now, it wasn't just him. It was the duo of Chovy and Ruler. It felt like 2022 all over again, where these two are just absolutely better than everybody else that they're going into. It was actually absurd how strong that they were. I think there were some concerns that Duro would struggle in a series like this against a really good team like Hanwha Life, out of the gate, but I had a lot of faith in Duro. I talked about that in my primer and, talked about it a lot last year when he was playing for FearX. I really like his game, and I really like the way that he fits on this team. Like, Gen.G is just dominant. Like, HLE losing it like this might be surprising to a lot of people because they were favorites in this series for a lot of people, but it certainly is not surprising to me. There definitely were some issues, but they were expected issues, I would say, with Hanwha Life. So we'll go ahead and get into it. Player of the series, I mean, you want to give it to Chovy, you want to give it to Ruler. They both absolutely dominated this series. It wasn't even remotely close. Both of them looked like absolute world beaters. Whoever you thought was more relevant, I think, is totally fair. Ruler was definitely more relevant as a carry in terms of damage in these fights. On the Ashe, on the Jinx, was really, really taking over a lot of these games, making Viper's life about as much of a living hell as you could possibly make it. But Chovy was the one that was like the big disruptor, I would say, for especially game number 2. It was so funny. Every single single team fight, watching Chovy just interrupt the Ornn ult every single time, on repeat, over and over again. Zeus did a pretty miserable job appealing for his AD carry, and that left Viper open for Chovy to be able to take advantage of, with, not just Chovy, but Canyon as well. It was just a really, really good showing by the two carry duo players here of Gen.G, and I think whoever you want to give player of the series to is totally fine. Again, I gave it to Ruler because of the damage, because I do value, carrying the game a little bit more, but Chovy was excellent. And going deathless against Hanwha Life in 2 games is not easy. It's incredibly difficult, especially playing a frontline tank like Galio, or at least a frontliner like Galio, for him to be as consistent as he was. I mean, Chovy and Ruler were just actually unreal in these 2 games. I just want to give a big shout out to Duro. What a great Gen.G debut for Duro, not only on the Leona, but on the Lulu as well, kind of showing his versatility as a player. I love Duro. I loved his tape on FearX. I wanted to make him an All-Pro last year. In fact, I came really close, I think, to making him an All-Pro, even though he only played, half of the split. He really was that good for FearX. I think down the stretch, he was a huge reason why that team ended up getting top 6. And so to see him perform so well in this first series, especially because he gets to play with someone like Ruler, yeah, no, I'm not surprised. This is kind of what I was expecting. Canyon was excellent here, especially on the Xin Zhao, but got to play signature Nidalee in game number 1. That always looks great. And Keen was just straight up better than Zeus across the board. Gen.G was dominant from top to bottom, from start to finish. They were the better team, and it wasn't even remotely close. Again, I expected this team to kind of run the regular season here, run the domestic league in the LCK. It's what I talked about in the primer. I just think that this team is by far the most talented in the league, and that definitely came through here in series number 1. But for Hanwha Life on the other side, the problems that they had in this series, I think were relatively predictable. I think the only one that's definitely a bit disappointing is just how bad Viper was in these games. Obviously, the scoreline is awful, probably the worst on the team. Well, second worst on the team. We'll get into that in a second, but not all of it is his fault. It's really difficult to play things like Caitlyn and Tristana when you don't really have anyone on the team peeling for you in any circumstance. Delight was just way too squishy, was dying instantly. He was also really the only form of hard engage on the team in game number 2, which meant that he couldn't really sit back and just peel for Viper and allow the Tristana to do, her own thing, and so she ended up getting caught a lot. A lot of the time in that circumstance, the onus of peel is probably going to be on the top side, or at least on jungle, and neither of them played particularly well in this series. Zeus is a very easy choice for dud of the series. He was awful across these 2 games, and I hate to say it, I'm really not entirely surprised to see this. I talked about this in my primer, but Zeus as a regular season player has not had a really great track record. He's been mega inconsistent in these best of 3s. He was not an All-Pro last year, I believe in spring or summer, for me at least. I'm sure the LCK gave it to him because they give it to T1 players every split, but he was not an All-Pro player in either split for me, a top 3 top laner, and coming in here, the track record, especially against Keen, has not looked particularly good, and that definitely translated. He was useless in game number 2. I don't think I've seen a more useless game this week so far than Zeus, even in 2025, really, so far than Zeus's Ornn. It just was awful across the board. Peanut looked really bad, got completely outplayed in game 1 and game 2. Zeka couldn't really accomplish anything. Delight certainly wasn't doing anything. Like I said, Viper was entirely useless, definitely a candidate for dead of the series. Ruler completely outplayed him, but it's hopefully just series 1 for Hanwha Life. There's really not a lot of analysis that I can give here because everybody just lost. They were worse across the board. It was really just Zeka that wasn't getting obliterated by his individual matchup, and even then, it's not like he was even half as relevant as Chovy was on the other side of this. HLE just didn't even look like they were in the same ballpark, and that's a big plus to Gen.G. They are clearly the team to beat in the LCK, and it stunned me to look at the analysts and see that everybody picked HLE to win this series, because to me, Gen.G on paper should be the team that everybody is kind of bowing down to. I'm glad to see that people are waking back up on Ruler, and domestic Chovy is domestic Chovy. He's going to be able to dominate like this. They probably have the 2 best players in the league at the current moment, and that should make them favorites in almost any capacity. Then moving on to the second series of day number 3, of course, the start of the second half of the week. And we saw NS RedForce taking on OK BRION to kick that off. 2 0-1 teams kicking off this second stage. And NS is going to be the one that's picking up a victory here, going 1-1 and winning at 2-0, which means that they come out of this week with a winning record at 3-2 in terms of game score. That's a pretty decent place to be after week number 1 for NS, considering how poor I think a lot of Kespa Cup ended up going for them. I think that there was a lot of negative emotions towards them going into a series or going into the LCK Cup like this, and I think they have kind of been exactly what I thought they would be. They are a team that I think will be competitive against the middle tier. The middle table teams are pretty clearly, in my opinion, better than the bad teams in the league. Definitely have more going for them, even if they still have their own problems, but they're probably going to be, firmly mid-table, like that number 7 team, that classic number 7, unless, one of the top 6 end up disappointing, and, we'll talk about that from there. But for Bro, This is just them crashing back down to earth, in my opinion. So many people had so many high expectations for them after Kespa Cup. Year in and year out, Kespa Cup continues to not matter, and it continues to be proven over and over again that it's really difficult to kind of project the Kespa Cup winner or, you know, teams that overperform at the Kespa Cup to continue that into the LCK, and that was the case here. They end up making a change in the bot lane that I really don't like, taking Hype out and putting Bull in. I get that they want to try and play both of these guys because they're not sure who they want to move forward with, but I think that that's kind of a crazy thing to say. Bull should not be in the starting lineup here at all for Bro, and we'll get to that. But for Nongshim, player of the series is going to go to Kingin. On the top side, criticized him quite a bit for that first series against DNF because he just wasn't very good in that series, but he dominated against Bro. Like, this was a very, very, very good series from Kingin on kind of his signature Gangplank, something that he has played so much of over the course of his career. It's not exactly in the strongest spot in the world right now, but still definitely good enough for you to be able to play it and capitalize on it. You know, this was just kind of what you wanted to see from King, and Morgan is a good player and doesn't always lose in matchups like this. Like, Morgan is talented enough to be able to go toe-to-toe with a player like Kingin, but if he's going to step up and actually just dominate that and really take over in the mid to late game with these team fighters as well, things like Rumble and Gangplank that are much more focused on trying to win in the 5v5 than anything else, you know, kind of win these Otacon skirmishes if you really want to kind of classify them as that. I think that's going to be a really good strategy for Kingin. I also think that, you know, Gideon and Jiwoo continue to look really good as options for this team. Gideon was awesome in week number 1. I actually think he looked about as good as you could ever ask him to look as the starting jungler for Nongshim. Again, that upward trajectory just kind of continuing to grow here. He was on Bro last year as their big off-season pickup, and, you know, I was kind of praising him on that team because I do think he was the only one even trying to win games for them. He's gotten even better so far at the start of week number 1, and I think it is pretty sustainable, and it's especially nice to see it on champions like Sejuani and Maokai, because you never really know when aggressive players are able to kind of, you know, bring it in, you know, reel it in a little bit and play a little bit more for the team. It's nice to see that he can still do that and be super successful at doing that. But, you know, Jiwoo's a great carry. It's nice to see Nongshim win games without Jiwoo having to 1v9. Lehens, we know exactly what he is going to be for the team at this point. Like, it is as clear as day what Lehens is now in 2025. The Elise is obviously something you would kind of expect out of Lehens. It's been growing in popularity in solo queue. You know, I've talked about it a bit on this channel in the past, but it's not entirely shocking. It, you know, probably surprised a lot of people, but it makes sense for Lehens. He's just going to be the most aggressive support in the entire world. Like, that's his role here. He's clearly like, okay, well, I'm going to throw every dart at the board because I feel like I am the best player on the Rift when we play a lot of these games, and if that's the case, then I'm just going to create as much as possible and hope that the rest of the team can follow up on it. I think it's an okay strategy, as KDA is probably going to suffer for it in a lot of instances, but he's going to be a big impact on this team. The only concern is that Fisher is still a pretty major question mark. His mechanics are just not particularly good. Closer was the better mid laner, I would say, across these games, which is not surprising. Again, Closer is kind of the difference between the good mid laners and the bad mid laners. He's like the most stereotypical average LCK mid laner that you could possibly get, and Fisher's just not at the level where he's going to be able to, like, win against a lot of mid laners, but at the end of the day, he wasn't horrible. He didn't run the game down. He didn't lose the series or lose a game for Nongshim. He was good enough to allow the rest of the team to be able to carry him, and that's really all you need to ask for out of the middle of the map. We talked about how jungle mid was supposed to be a weakness. Well, if jungle is actually going to be a strength, or at least a growing strength, and if mid's not going to be nearly as strong of a weakness as you may have expected, Nongshim can break into that top 6, and they are likely on the winner's side of this group, or the winning group, if you will. And so, you know, it's going to be interesting to see how things go, but this is a pretty good start, I would say, all things considered, for Nongshim. And then for Bro, obviously, it's not a good start. 0-2 is not good. 1-4 is not good. The fact that they're making roster substitutions and kind of moving players in and out, I think just shows, like, an organizational incompetence that they have continued to show year in and year out. I just think this is a really poorly run organization, and as funny as it is, and as easy as it is to be a Bro leaver and to cheer for Bro, they've gained so much publicity purely from being like a funnily named team. Like, if their track record with their history of how this organization has been run was translated to basically any other org in the world that didn't have as funny of a name, there would be no fan base to this team. We would be laughing at them constantly. Like, they are essentially what Immortals was in North America for so many years, where they're this team that just continues to shoot themselves in the foot, regardless of how much good young talent they're able to bring in. And it seems like they're kind of the career destroyer here in the LCK. Hambach is once again going to get done of the series. He was really bad in week number 1. That Nocturne game was just horrendous. I mean, it was truly, like, awful. Like, there's no other way to say it. He was miserably bad in game number 1. wasn't great in game number 2. Morgan, I think, could also theoretically be dead of the series. I very much considered giving this to Polu, who looked way worse without hype in at the bot lane, and, you know, maybe even give it to Bull just purely because he shouldn't be in the series. But at the end of the day, like, bro just looks outclassed basically across the board. When Closer is the player on your team that's performing the best in a series like this, like, you're never going to be able to win it. Closer is not the kind of player that's going to hard carry or primary carry a team to a victory against, like, an actually good team across the Rift, and it's just kind of the case. Hanwha has to be better. They had a ton of expectations for him coming into the year, and that transition from the Challengers League to the LCK, it's hard, and I hope this proves to people that I'm not lying when I say that no matter how good you think your favorite prospect is, they are going to have a hard time week 1, week 2 in the LCK. It's just not easy to immediately come in and make a big impact. Hanwha, I think, is a great example of that, but if Polu is going to continue to be bad, if this team is randomly going to continue messing with the formula and just pulling players in and out, playing with this 6-man roster, never giving these players enough time to scrim together and get like an actual cohesive like communication strategy together, then they're going to continue to be bad. Bro just is so incompetent from the top down that it's really frustrating to watch. And then for Nongshim, like, I'm glad they got the win. Again, maybe they're competitive, maybe they're not. Maybe they just beat Bro, and maybe they looked good against DNF because DNF isn't actually all that dominant. We don't really know yet. It's such a small sample size, and there's so much up in the air in the LCK. But at the end of the day, at least Gideon is looking like he's going in a good direction. Kingen and Lehens look like good offseason additions, and Fisher can just stay fine. Like, he doesn't have to be good. As long as he's average, like, Nongshim could be a team that competes for mid-table. Then moving on now to day number 4, and it's finally a matchup between 1-0 teams. It's Dplus KIA taking on the DN Freecs. And Dplus KIA continues their hot streak by picking up a 2-0 series win over a DNF team that looked really good in their first series against Nongshim. DK looks awesome at the start of this year. I mean, you couldn't have drawn up a better week number 1, I think, for this team overall. So many things going right for them, and I think a lot of things just kind of clicking into place. It feels like this team has great chemistry together. It feels like Beryl is really locked in and really helping the team, with the exception of game number 2, which obviously we'll talk about, and even then, still made probably the most important play in the entire game in game number 2, even being like an 0-9 elite support. But overall, it just feels like everybody's kind of bringing their A game at the start of this year. Hopefully that's something that can continue for DK, because this is a better version of them than anything we saw last year, and it's only been 2 series. Like, I'm already so impressed with what we've seen. For DNF, I think this is obviously an unfortunate loss, but it's really not the worst one in the world. DK looks incredible at the current moment, and, you know, there were some things that I think you could be encouraged by coming out of this series, so we'll talk about it here. Player of the series, to me, is pretty obviously going to go to Lucid. This guy is just playing out of his mind once again to start this split. He kind of did this at the start of the summer split as well. He did keep it up. I'm not trying to say he fell off in summer or anything. He was really good in the summer split last year, but hopefully he can keep up this like MVP type of form, because through the first couple of series here, he has looked about as good as you could possibly look as a jungler in this instance. He looks very connected to the rest of his team. Him and Beryl seem to have really good chemistry as a jungle support duo, which is super important. It's actually something we'll talk about on the other side of this that feels like it's a bit of a problem for DNF, and it does feel like Lucid and Showmaker just play together really well. Aiming obviously benefits a lot from the things that Lucid creates, but playing something like Zilean Pantheon, like, I wouldn't have considered Zilean Pantheon to be something that I'm like thinking about all that much in terms of like even in full Fearless. Like, it's not really something that I'm considering, but yeah, they have really good chemistry, and Lucid actually played the Pantheon at a super high level. It was really, really cool to see, and it's really nice to see those off-meta picks, especially in full Fearless, actually end up working out. So hopefully Lucid can keep this really good stretch of form going, because it has been a great stretch of form. Obviously, Showmaker was also excellent here. Bulldog was actually really good on the other side of this matchup. I do not want to like undersell Bulldog. We'll get to him when we talk about DNF, because he was the best player on the Rift, I would say, for DNF, but Showmaker was also really good. He played Set mid and then Zilean mid. This full Fearless format is kind of built for Showmaker, because he is like so weird and creative with a lot of his picks. I think it's really cool seeing players like Doenby come back into pro play over in the LPL, and Showmaker kind of get into this format where he allows himself to have a little bit more fun from a game-to-game basis. It's really bringing back a lot of positive vibes, I would say, to League of Legends, and definitely Showmaker thrives off of positive vibes. Aiming, going deathless in this series is super impressive. Once again, I don't think he did anything extraordinary. Like, I don't think you watch the tape and say like, oh, he created these opportunities and he was so perfect at taking advantage of them. I think for the most part, the scoreline is kind of an indicator of just how aggressive the rest of the team was, but Beryl inted him super hard in game number 2. It would have been really easy for the Ezreal to fall super far behind and not be particularly relevant. He was still very relevant in that game, even with his support kind of running it, and that's a credit to aiming. He's really good at staying neutral. And Siwoo also has started off, I think, his LCK tenure really hot. I was talking a bit in the bro section about how it's very difficult to translate from Challengers League to the LCK, and to see Siwoo actually be really good right now is really positive. Now, not everything is perfect. He is crazy aggressive, and he definitely needs to dial that back. He died a couple of times on Rumble in situations that he had no business dying in. He's, you know, the positioning is definitely still a question mark. It reminds me a lot of Perfect last year, and he was the player I definitely compared him to coming up, and so it's nice to see that that has translated well, but just like Perfect, he's good enough for you to be able to win with early on in his career, especially if Lucid is going to, you know, take 2025, that sophomore season, as the year to kind of break out here. That's going to be awesome for DK. They just look super cohesive, super strong right now, and I imagine this team is going to continue to be a major threat throughout the rest of the year. And then for DNF, like, as much as I want to sit here and be like, oh, obviously losing 0-2 is not good and the score lines look not good, there are issues on this team, but generally I think this loss is fine. I think Berserker and Bulldog played fine. I certainly think they're the players that you're kind of excusing the most here. Bulldog's scoreline doesn't look all that great, but trust the tape, like, trust your eyes. Bulldog was actually really good in these games and was a big reason why they were even in game number 2 at all on the Talia. I'm certainly not going to criticize him too much, although he did get caught by Barrel's Elise at the back half of the game, and that essentially lost DNF the game. You know, it's the one good play Barrel made in game number 2, but outside of that, Bulldog was really good, I would say, throughout that second game, and Berserker I don't think was the issue here. I think the big issue that I want to highlight is Pyosik and Life. I know neither of them are dead of the series, and we'll get to Dudu in a second, who was not very good in this series, but Pyosik has this weird problem where it just doesn't seem like he can ever get on the same page as any of the supports he's playing with. It was a huge issue on DRX when he was playing with Barrel. It got a little bit better with Barrel on KT Rolster, but this was an issue on Team Liquid as well when he was playing with Core JJ, where it never really felt like they were on the same page. It felt like they were always kind of contrasting in terms of the styles that they were putting out there, and it's really the case once again here with Life. I'm not really sure what it is with Pyosik that makes his style so unapproachable for other support players and makes it difficult for those players to actually assist him in a lot of things, but they were basically on opposite pages throughout the entirety of this series. That has to get better. I like Berserker and Life, and I liked their chemistry together. I think it looked good, but Pyosik so far has really not impressed me. This first week was a bad one for Pyosik, and it's certainly one that I think he needs to turn around. Life also, of course, had his problems, but I'm significantly more forgiving of Life's series than I am of Pyosik, so I think did once again play a lot worse. Neither of them are dead of the series, though. That is going to go to Dudu in the top lane. That Gnar game was just absolutely disgustingly bad. Like, there's no other way to say it. I know the scoreline doesn't appear to be miserable. The Mbessa wasn't much better in game number 1, but, you know, it happens every once in a while. I think you would expect Dudu to actually just win this matchup against Siwoo. You would hope that this would be a positive matchup topside for DNF, but it really did not end up working out that way. He can be a bit of a flippy player. That is kind of the big criticism when it comes to him. I think a lot of top laners end up falling into that regard, and so I'm not going to, like, freak out over one bad series, but he does want to, you know, increase that consistency in order to try to get to the top 3 top laners, and this was not a showcase that kind of put you there. But there are some things that DNF could clean up and fix, and I definitely think Pyosik needs to start playing better. But at the end of the day, losing to this version of DK actually seems entirely fine. They look incredible at the current moment, maybe like the best looking team to come out of week number 1 in the entirety of the LCK. We'll see what happens later on in the week with Gen.G, obviously, but DK looks excellent, about as good as you could ever ask for, and it looks like this could be the year that they break out again. But then moving on to our second series of day number 4 and World Finals from 2022 rematch here with DRX taking on T1. And we do flip the win-loss column for both of these teams, T1 picking up the 2-0 series win, DRX dropping their first series of the year. No shocker here, this was the expected outcome, but it's nice to see T1 actually turn things around after a really bad start against DK. But we just saw that DK is actually really good. Like, this is a team that you actually have to watch out for near, like, the finals. Like, this is not a team that's just, like, a one and done, or at least that's not what I would expect. So T1's loss definitely feels a bit more justified now after that destruction of DNF. But, again, DRX not really a team that's going to be able to compete with T1 regardless of how well UCal played. And UCal played awesome. Like, UCal going into Faker, super fun matchup. Really glad to see him back in the LCK. And for UCal to actually not only hold his own, but be really good in a series like this, it's super impressive to watch, but at the end of the day, the rest of the team just couldn't quite keep up. Player of the series for me is going to go to Guma Yushi. I think it really is between Guma, KIA, and Owner. Should be one of those 3. Owner definitely has the best scoreline if you really want to go down that route, but to me, the bot lane was the main characters of this series. The Caitlyn Elise is definitely going to be what a lot of people are taking away from game number 2 here. This is how you play Elise support correctly if Beryl wants to take some lessons. Obviously, Beryl was super aggressive in the early game, and that's generally what you have to do, is just snowball the lane, but Caitlyn is such a perfect AD carry to capitalize on that Elise, and Guma is obviously the best Caitlyn in the world. He has been for a very long time. It's a champion that he feels super comfortable on, and I really do think this bot lane is going to be something we're seeing a lot more out of T1, so long as we are still in full Fearless, and Guma took really big advantage of that. He was the carry of this team in game number 2. He certainly was the one that they were playing around in terms of their resources. Again, if you want to give it to Owner because his scoreline looked a little bit better, I do kind of understand that. Hell, if you wanted to give it to KIA because he actually was really good on Elise support, I think that's also fair. Like, I think to me it's between the two bot lane members, but Guma definitely the standout for me. I think Doran was also fine here. People, again, are going to criticize him for every little thing that he does because they go in with a preconceived notion that Doran is bad, but I think this is exactly what he needed to do in a lot of instances. Was everything perfect on the Rumble? No. Everything was not perfect on the Rumble. The Jace also had some problems in game number 1, but at the end of the day, he was still super relevant in these fights, and he was kind of a late game insurance policy for a team that didn't really know what they were going to look like in the late game, picking Lee Sin, Caitlyn, Elise as their early game focus. And so, you know, credit to Doran, a lot of responsibility kind of put on him in that regard. Faker was much better, I would say, here in this second series. Definitely struggled quite a bit in series 1, but the Galio, such a classic pick, especially after last year's Worlds, and the Aurora actually looked really good for him as well. Really excited to see if that's something they continue to pick up a lot. You know, Galio can be flexed onto the top side, certainly something I would expect a player like Doran to be able to pilot well. And Aurora also kind of fits that regard as well. Like, she can go topside if really need be. Overall, this was just a clean win, I would say, from T1. Not exactly quite as clean as maybe the scorelines would indicate. Game number 1 was pretty bloody and was pretty action-packed, but at the end of the day, T1 was definitely the better team here, and they were able to play through their stars and their comfort, and I think that's really what you want to see. Them getting outside of the box kind of gets them in the box, if you will. And then for DRX, like, it's UCal versus the world. That's really kind of the narrative that's going to be surrounding, I think, this team for the rest of the year. He really is that good. He is on the same level as a Showmaker or a BDD or a Zeka. Like, respectfully to those players, I'm not trying to disrespect them. UCal is just genuinely unbelievably good, and I think people are going to start waking up to that now that he's back in the LCK. I think a lot of analysts were just, you know, critical of his time in the LPL because nobody watches that region. Like, respectfully to the people who do the LCK broadcast, nobody really watches that region, and I think UCal has been really good for a really long time, and he's getting to prove that on a bigger stage now, but the rest of this team is just not good enough. The bot lane, just like it was good for T1, was kind of bad for DRX. Lazy Feel kind of giving that international buff to T1, if you will, with him finally being in, you know, the first import player in the LCK, was not good on the Corki. Corki has been miserably unsuccessful in the LCK in week number 1. We'll talk about that at the end of the video, but dud of the series for me is going to go to Ondol in the support position. This was a horrible series from Ondol. I'm not going to sit here and say that Playta would have instantly made this team better, or he wouldn't have, like, had a poor series or anything like that, because KIA was on point, Gumayushi was on point, and this is a difficult matchup to end up trying to take advantage of, but Ondol was horrible. Like, he truly was unplayable in this series. The Leona, the Poppy, just got completely outplayed, was in really bad situations. One of the weaker support performances we've seen all year so far. He does usually start splits hot, talked about that, but that was not the case here. Him and Lazy Feel definitely were not able to carry over that success they had against Bro here to T1. Rich also just kind of outplayed. That Ornn game was really, really horrific in game number 2. Doran just had a ton of prio, even if he wasn't entirely strong. Like, throughout the entirety of the game, Rich, you know, hit or miss, we'll just say. He is a very hit or miss player. Unfortunately, this time it was a miss. I think the positive for DRX is not only that UCal looks good, but that Sponge has not been, like, obscenely negative for this team. He's not been actively instantly losing them games like he was for a lot of last year. We could potentially be seeing like a Sylvie-esque type of arc for Sponge. He was the player I actually compared Sponge to, was Sylvie, and obviously Sylvie is benched now, but Sylvie got much better in year 2 for Nongshim than he was in year number 1. Still wasn't perfect, still wasn't like actively winning games for Nongshim, but certainly was less of a detriment. I could see Sponge kind of on a similar trajectory, but at the end of the day, that's probably not good enough for them to be able to compete. 8 feels pretty accurate. They look like they're better than the worst teams in the league, like Bro, when they were able to beat them on day number 1, but they're definitely not on the level to be able to compete with T1, regardless of how good UCal is. But it's an important win for T1. Getting at least one win into the column is relevant because every single one of these series matters. Like, T1 could go undefeated from here on out and still be in losers group. It's genuinely crazy to see the position that they put themselves in, but hopefully the bot lane can continue to think outside the box, can continue to go for a lot of these more aggressive, you know, 2v2 lanes that really work for them. Owner, I think, had a great bounce back, and Faker, I think, definitely felt more comfortable on these facilitators. T1's finding its style, and they're finding their way around this new map. We'll just have to see if that actually encourages them domestically to perform the way that they probably should be performing, given how good they are. But that's going to bring us to our final day of action here in the LCK in week number 1, day number 5, and it's a good matchup to kick off the final day. It's KT Rolster taking on Hanwha Life, and HLE is going to get their turnaround revenge for whatever happened earlier in the week against Gen.G by picking up a dominant 2-0 victory against KT. This is, again, the expected outcome. I think KT Rolster right now feels like the worst of, like, the big upper teams. Not that DNF is, like, guaranteed to be good, and perhaps you include Nongshim in that list if you really want to do that, but it definitely feels like KT is a little bit less consistent across the board than teams like, you know, Dplus KIA and T1 and these other teams that are going to be competing around, like, number 3 or number 4, and HLE is genuinely a really good team. They just ran into the best team in the league who was kind of eager to make a point, we'll just say, in their first series. So this is a great bounce back. Player of the series is going to go to Zeka. It's very funny because I actually think this is really similar to what we saw out of Gen.G in their series against HLE, where it's just the carry duo popping off and looking unbelievably good. Zeka and Viper were definitely the 2 players to keep an eye on in this series, but instead of, you know, Ruler being the one to really pop off and the AD carry, you know, kind of really being the one to dominate a lot of the headlines, it deservedly is Zeka here. Not only does he get to play Azir in game number 1, one of his better champions, but he gets to play his best champion, or, you know, what I would consider to be one of his best champions in Akali. I know a lot of people call him an assassin merchant. I'm finally starting to see the English, like, LCK broadcast not hammer that point home into oblivion as if it's the only thing that's true. Zeka has proven over and over again that he's good on mages. He's, like, a great mid laner on mages. He's just one of the best in the world on assassins. Like, when you're looking at a top 5 player in the world, that's what Zeka is when he gets to play his most comfortable champions, and that's what Akali is. She very much fits that mold. Poor Dectum never has stood a chance in this series. Obviously, a lot of it was his fault as well, just not really being in the right spot, but oh my god, like, Ziggs into Akali, like a mega fed Akali, feels like an absolute nightmare to end up playing out, and Zeka certainly did, like, turn it into Dectum's nightmare. So credit to him. This guy is still one of the best players in the world and is more than deserving, I would say, of being considered a top 2 or a top 3 mid laner in the LCK, and really a top 5 player in the world at times. And then Viper, great bounce back. I really didn't think he was that good against Gen.G. It very much felt like he was completely outplayed by Ruler in basically every capacity. Kind of a statement series from Ruler in that respect, because so many people were saying that Viper should have been better than Ruler in my primer videos, but he definitely had the bounce back here. That spacing, the gliding, the ability to just attack move and to position perfectly, like, it's insane. Viper's mechanics are genuinely unreal, and I think in 99% of series, Viper ends up as the best player on the Rift. In a series like this, Zeka was just a little bit better, in my opinion. Viper was excellent, though. Really, whoever you want to give it to out of the 2 of them, it's entirely deserved. It's just, you know, whichever one you ended up preferring, in the same way that I said that about Chovy and Ruler earlier. Zeus was much better in this series than he was in the previous one. Peanut's Lee Sin was something. Certainly a game from Peanut. I think he's fine. Like, I'm not concerned about him. I'm not sure how much they're going to play Lee Sin from this point onwards, but you can't say it wasn't one of the more entertaining parts of the entire week, and Delight was obviously a big part of why Viper was so successful as well. Just a great series from HLE, in the same way that they kind of got trounced across the board in their first series. They kind of trounced KT across the board in this one. But for KT Rolster, like, they are a very flawed team conceptually. They're just not a team that has, like, a ton of consistency. BDD, I talked about this in the primer, needs to be like Superman in order to get this team near the top 3 or the top 4. He kind of was that in their first series, but there's a reason that I don't think that's going to happen, is because I think BDD is just naturally going to be a little bit more inconsistent than, you know, players like Zeka, and we saw that in this matchup where Zeka was better. Like, not all of this is on BDD. I'm not certainly trying to make him out to be the problem on this team. He was not the problem. He was the best player on KT in this series, but, like, you need a superhuman effort out of BDD, and that's not really what he gave you, and the rest of the team just wasn't good enough to be able to go toe-to-toe with the other people on the other side of this. Cuz another series that was relatively rough, I think Perfect got mega abused in this matchup against Zeus. They put so much effort and attention into trying to get Perfect into a decent matchup, and, you know, putting a lot of attention into trying to gank Zeus early in a lot of these games, and he still was not particularly effective in the back half. That is a concerning trait, but this bot lane was horrible. I mean, Wei was bad, but Dectum was awful. I mean, dud of the series, dud of the game. Like, this was a miserable showing from Dectum. Like, just nothing positive to really say about the performance that he put out there. I know a lot of people were really critical of Dectum I'm a bit of a Dectum defender because I think he's good for what he is. I think people have this like black and white approach on League of Legends, and generally, you know, I'm not going to get into this, but I think most people online just like speak in absolutes. They speak in, you know, either the best or either the worst. Like they're the middle ground, the gray area just doesn't really exist in a lot of online discussions for many things, but that definitely translates to League of Legends. And Dectum is unfortunately a player that I think very much fits that like gray area. There are going to be situations where he is a positive and where he is a lot better than a lot of people call him out to be, but he's not a star. Like, he's not going to be able to go up against Zeka and Viper when they're playing really well and be able to survive that, and he's certainly probably not good enough to be able to get KT to, like, top 3 or top 4 if he's going to be asked to have a big role on this team. I think this was an uncharacteristically bad series from him. I don't expect this to continue. If it does, that's definitely a problem, but I see so many people talking about, like, oh, KT should have just kept Hype. Well, I don't know if you're getting a better result out of Hype in a series like this. It's not like he showed excellent traits on Bro in their first series against DRX. He got outplayed by Lazy Feel, and so, you know, as much as I'd love to sit here and say that, like, oh, I'd love to agree with the community and Dectum sucks and ha ha ha, we should have, you know, done whatever, right? Like, it's just one of those circumstances where it's to be determined. Dectum has always been a player that's floated around, like, good and bad games, and it's all just really about where he ends up landing. If this is more of the realistic version of Dectum that we end up getting, then that's going to be a bit of a problem, but, you know, I'm going to give him some grace and say that this was probably, like, the low end of what you can expect to see out of him, especially against an HLE team that felt incredibly motivated in this series to dominate. I'm not going to criticize him too heavily, but Wei, also not particularly good. Like, this was a guy who was super good at the LCK Challengers League level, and has also kind of struggled to make that transition. It's just really difficult, and so overall, KT was mega outclassed here, and I think number 6 feels like a pretty apt place to put them right now. They are a team that I think will be in the running to be near top 5 or top 6, but top 4 right now feels terrifying to try and break into, assuming you still value T1. And then for Hanwha Life on the other side, like Zeka and Viper, when they play like this, they are unbeatable. If they played like this against Gen.G, they would have won, but at the end of the day, like, it's just, you gotta hope you get the right performance on the right day. We know that they are capable of destroying anybody in the world. The inconsistency is just always going to exist with this team inherently, but they are, you know, world favorites when everything is going right. But that's going to bring us to our final series of the week here, our final series of week 1, and it's a top of the table versus bottom of the table clash between BNK FearX and Gen.G. Of course, predictably, Gen.G is going to come out on top, 2-0 series win here. This was not really all that up for debate. Pretty slow series, all things considered, not necessarily the thrashing that they gave Hanwha Life earlier, but I also don't think they were quite as, like, mentally locked in. This was still a really good performance from Gen.G. I'm certainly not trying to criticize the way that they ended up playing this out. Definitely won in a different way. Ruler and Duro were not quite as dominant. Diablo and Kellen actually had a really good series, I would say, on the other side of this matchup, but the top side of the map was just so lost for BNK that there was never really going to be a time where they actually were going to be able to compete, especially in that second game. So let's go ahead and talk about it. Of course, player of the series is going to go to Chovy in this instance, as you can see on your screen. I think this is very debatable if you want to give it to Chovy or if you want to give it to Keen on the top side. It should go to one of those two. They were both incredibly dominant throughout both of these games. Really, Chovy, I thought, was a little bit more consistent. I think Vikla definitely, you know, was a little bit more game, I would say, in the mid lane than someone like Clear was on the top side. Even if Vikla wasn't perfect in this, he was definitely trying harder than someone like Clear was on the top side, and Chovy still was able to take advantage of him just as much. I'm just so impressed with Chovy. Like, what else do you want me to say? If you want me to sit here and tell you that Chovy's playing bad, you're just not going to get that out of me. This guy is so dominant against everybody he plays against in the entire world. Vikla is obviously not the kind of mid laner that can actively go toe-to-toe with Chovy and keep up, even if he is trying to play well. It's just a dominant performance and a fantastic week for Chovy. Not that that should be surprising or shocking to literally anybody involved, but Keem, definitely the other player that you have to shout out here for Gen.G as having a really good series. This top lane matchup was just an absolute disaster. There's really no other way to talk about it. Keen obliterated Clear. Like, it was never close under any circumstance, whether in game 1 or in game 2. And Keen, at his best, is going to do that, especially against the top laners that have not really proven themselves to be, like, super good at the LCK level. You know, beating up on Zeus and kind of obliterating him, you know, that's kind of it's par for the course for Keen. He does that in the playoffs all the time, but let's not pretend like he doesn't do that exact same thing against all of the bottom tier top laners as well. So credit to Keen. He continues to be really, really good. Canyon was once again really good here. I think Raptor was generally fine on the other side of this. Certainly not my biggest problem with BFX in this series, but Canyon continues to be Canyon, and somehow, some way, he continues to get Nidalee in a lot of these games and just pops off on them. Like I said, Ruler and Duro, definitely not quite as dominant of a series as they had in the first series, but that's mostly because Diablo was actually really good on the other side of this matchup, and I'll talk about him. There is a very, very clear better player comparison to me when it comes to Diablo that I think is, you know, both a positive and a negative, I would say, for Fox. But Ruler and Duro didn't need to step up here. The top side of the map was genuinely so dominant for Gen.G. The solo laners in particular just absolutely obliterated BFX, and it created a situation where they were able to win really, really easily. And then for BFX on the other side, there are positives. This bot lane was really good in this series. You would argue, and I would argue, that they were the better bot lane in this series, and I'm not exactly saying that that's going to translate throughout an entire split, but it's really good to know that that is at least possible for FearX, because that is going to be genuinely, in my opinion, their only consistent win condition. Raptor is a good player and can carry games, but certainly not against like actually good teams. Is he going to be expected to carry the entirety of the load? I think Diablo is going to need to break out and kind of be that guy here in the bot lane. And you know what? He kind of was in this series. The player that I'm comparing him to is Paddock. I know it kind of feels like a lazy comparison, but their playstyles are so similar, and I think their skill levels are so similar that to me it's a very, very like easy plug and play. If people remember Paddock on DRX a couple of years ago, he subbed in for Dectum when he got injured and just kind of stayed in for the rest of 2023 summer. Was super aggressive. Easily the most aggressive ADC I've evaluated on this channel, and I think Diablo is very much built in that mold. He is like crazy aggro, very much willing to try to flip 1v1 or 2v2 in a lot of instances, and sometimes that really works out. He doesn't have like this gigantic mechanical ceiling, but the aggressive tendencies that he has are so jarring to try to deal with for a lot of AD carries that sometimes he can overcome matchups where he's not the better AD carry. He can still get more out of those matchups than a lot of other players that are better than him, purely because he's at least trying to gain resources. It's kind of the anti-Teddy, if you will. Like, I talk about Teddy all the time being so mechanically talented, but not really having the mentality or the eagerness to go and like generate his own lead. Diablo is not going to have the talent to be able to beat everybody, but he certainly is going to give the effort to try and do so, which I can really respect. And you know what? Kellen played really well in this series. I thought he was really, really good for BFX. I think people are still going to point at him and say that he's like some albatross, some hindrance, but this bot lane is really working, and his playstyle really actually does allow Diablo to play more aggressive, which was something I really wasn't sure was going to be the case when we kind of kicked off the season, when I ranked this team number 10. So that's the positive. The negative is that these solo laners suck. Like, they are not good. Vikla just does not have the talent to go up against Chovy. He tried, like, he gave it an effort, but he just didn't really have the ability to stay on pace and to keep up with him. He's just not nearly going to be on the same level. We saw it earlier in the same week out of Vikla. When he's playing against real, like, mid laners, he's just not going to be able to compete, and Clear was awful. I mean, easy dud of the series. This is one of the weaker series of the entire week for basically anybody. He just got obliterated, like, completely run through, I would say, by Keen. He's going to have to be better than this. I don't know if it's like a mental checkout thing, because it honestly looked like he wasn't particularly locked in, which is frustrating considering how locked in it felt like Raptor, Vikla, Diablo, Kellen, like, all of them were clearly, like, amped up to play this series against Gen.G, but Clear just fell completely flat on his face. This was an awful series from him. Never has been a consistent player. He's always going to have bad games and bad weeks. He's going to have good weeks as well. You know, he actually grades out okay, especially going back and looking at some of the previous splits. He's not nearly as negative, as much of a negative as I would generally say his tape would indicate, but at the same time, like, this is the kind of performance that shows me that he's just never going to be like an average LCK top laner. Like, you just don't get obliterated like this as regularly as he does if you're an average LCK top laner. So overall for BFX, like, we know where they land. They're probably one of the weaker teams in the entire league, but at least they're trying. At least they have some players that are willing to kind of try to flip games and create these crazy circumstances that good teams might not be able to adapt to as quickly, but they just don't have the talent to actually be able to compete with Gen.G, who's the best team in the world. Like, Gen.G and BLG certainly in the first week here have jumped out to some pretty heavy leads, like Gen.G going undefeated, BLG obviously looking super dominant in their LPL debut. You know, obviously Dplus KIA has looked really good domestically as well, and HLE looked like they were great outside of the Gen.G series, but Gen.G kind of feels like the team that's on top of the mountain right now, and as long as that continues to be the case domestically, I'm not going to rank them anything other than number 1. All right, but that is going to do it for my LCK Cup week number 1 overview and analysis video. Up on the screen, the standings after the first week. Now, this might look a little bit weird in terms of the numbers. Of course, I've separated Group Baron and Group Elder. Group Baron on the left, Group Elder on the right. You can see that it's currently 3 versus 7. The magic number is 13. If you can hit 13 wins for one of the groups, that is a 1 group. That is over 50% of the games. It would be 13 to 12 at the very minimum, and so you need need to hit that 13 margin in order to win it. Obviously, Group Elder is out to a great start. I'm really glad to have called that. That seemed to have been kind of anti-consensus, especially if you check a lot of the other things. But the way that this like standings page is structured, obviously you can see the rankings within each group, but the numbers that are like the standings number that I have next to everybody on the left indicates what their current seed would be if the season ended right now. And so even with Nongshim like having the same record as T1, the reason they would be the 3 seed is because they're the 3rd team in Group Elder at the current moment, if that makes sense. Any ties are obviously just broken alphabetically. I'm not trying to show any favoritism here, but top 3 teams from winner's group do end up going on immediately to like the real playoffs instead of the play-ins. Bottom 2 teams from the winning group and top 4 teams from the losing group end up going into the play-in stage to fight for, you know, a shot to get in. The 3 teams that make it out of that end up making it into the actual playoffs, if that makes sense. One team is eliminated in this stage, and it will be the worst team in the losing group. Right now, either BFX or Bro. I hope that makes sense. Hope that's what, you know, tracks in terms of when you look at these numbers, it's projected seeding or like what current seeding would be if the season were to end today. Of course, on the right, you can see my power ranking number. That's where I personally power rank all of these teams from number 1 to number 10, and change is going to be how that has changed from the preseason or from my primer video to right now. Very happy to say that I got this week super correct, and that means I don't need to make a lot of changes. I don't really need to kind of adjust a lot of things. I am going to put DK up to 3, and I am going to move T1 down to 4 because DK did look way better this week than T1, but of course, this is a very flexible scale. I think DK is probably looking better domestically at the current moment than someone like T1 is, but you never really know when they're going to be able to figure things out and turn things on. A lot of the issues that they had in that series against DK were very fixable, and so as long as they're able to actually fix those, that should be fine. I just really like DK. If I was more tepid or neutral on DK, then I probably would have left them at 4, but I'm kind of starting to buy in to this team potentially being like a world champion contender, and so we'll see if that ends up happening. It's something they really haven't been in the midst of in quite a while, in my opinion, but one thing I do want to throw up on the screen is the predictions from the LCK casters as opposed to mine, and I know this feels a bit self-indulgent, but allow me to explain why I'm bringing this up. I get a lot of comments and just generally people talking about, like, what is my criteria? You know, why am I credible? Why am I someone that people should be going to listen to? What's my track record? Like, what's the reason for people to watch this channel instead of just, you know, getting their analysis from the LCK Global broadcast? Well, you can see the predictions up on the screen for all of the people that, you know, all the people on broadcast that predicted these games. Like, I got almost every single series right this week. I went 9 out of 10. I was the only person to predict that Group Elder would be able to beat Group Baron. I was lower on Bro, which ended up really paying off. I was higher on Gen.G, which ended up really paying off. The only series that I got wrong was T1 losing to DK, and even then, like, that was an upset. Like, DK was 1 spot below T1 in my power rankings. It's not like I thought this was going to be, like, a free win or anything for T1. They would have obviously had to work for it, but I hope this goes to show that, like, there is some credibility in the analysis that I give, especially in the LCK, where I've been amusingly accurate. And this is kind of my case to be made that things are going right on this channel, and that clearly the process that I have is, you know, one that ends up working out. But I hope that that gives some more credence to some of the things I talk about, but that's the standings. That's me, you know, going over my success rate in week 1, at least a little bit. We'll see if that lasts, but it's time to get in to my player of the week and my dud of the week. And it's a funny little graphic up on the screen. We will obviously talk about that in a second. My player of the week is going to go to Chovy, the mid laner for Gen.G. They were so dominant this week. They looked so good, and he was incredible in both series. He genuinely could have gotten player of the series for both of them, only ended up getting it for the Fox series. But at the end of the day, Chovy's insane. If he's going to play like this the rest of the split, which is super realistic, he's going to be another very easy choice for MVP. Like, it's just ridiculous. He has his teammate as one of the runner-ups, Ruler, his AD carry, who was just unbelievable against Hanwha Life. He wasn't quite as dominant, I would say, against BFX, but that Hanwha Life series was genuinely so good, and Gen.G was just so successful. It's not like he was bad against BFX that, you know, he was a clear runner-up for me, but kind of the main runner-up was Lucid, the jungler for Dplus KIA. DK was awesome this week, and Lucid, to me, was really the standout player for them. If he's going to be on MVP pace as well throughout the beginning part of this season, that's going to be huge for DK, and it's really going to solidify them as one of the better teams in the world, because I really do trust Showmaker. I think aiming can be put in basically any situation you need him to, and Barrel looks like he's locked back in. Siwoo looks really good as a rookie, even if he does have his own flaws. Like, if Lucid is an actual top 10 player in the world, which I think is pretty realistic to maybe expect out of him this year, that's ginormous for DK. So those are my Chovy's my player of the week, and those are my runner-ups. And then my dud of the week, as you can see, not a player. It will be a player in just a second, but my dud of the week is Corki. I mean, come on, dude. He went 0-9 in terms of these series in the LCK. This champion just looks incredibly weak at the LCK level because he struggles to be able to fight over Otacon and definitely doesn't really have prio to be able to help out in early skirmishes to get the feats of strength. Not that they feel particularly relevant, but it's crazy just how bad Corki did. Jokes aside, transitioning, dud of the week for me is going to be Hanwha, the jungler for OK BRION. He was really bad in week number 1, and I want to reiterate, just as like player of the week doesn't immediately indicate that I think this player is better than everybody else, dud of the week doesn't mean that I dislike the player or that I think they're a bad player. It just means that the 2 series they played this week weren't particularly good. There have been incredibly good players to get dud of the week before and then bounce back. KIA got dud of the week multiple times last year, and he's phenomenal, right? Like, he's one of the best players in the world. You can get a dud of the week and be able to recuperate and rebound, but Hanwha was just horrible this week in terms of the games that Bro played. There really weren't a lot of other options for me. I guess you could have theoretically gone for Vikla or Clear or somebody from BFX, but Hanwha to me was a pretty clear choice for being the weakest player on the Rift in week number 1. I hope that he can get his feet under him and, you know, kind of get back in. Especially, I really hope that Hype gets put back in for Bro, because there are so many things going on there, but that organization continues to just be incompetent basically at every level. But Hanwha's my dud of the week. Chovy is my player of the week. That's gonna do it. Let me know what you agree with or disagree with down in the comment section below. I know obviously not all of us are going to have the same exact opinions. Would love to know where your opinions differ. If you enjoyed the video, leave a like. It really does mean a lot to me. Lets me know you guys are enjoying the content, and it helps get this video out to a lot more people, which I'm always very appreciative of. If you're new here, hit subscribe. Of course, we'll be covering every week of the LCK Cup, including, you know, the play-ins and the playoffs and all of that stuff, but we're covering all 3 of the other major regions as well: LTA North, LEC, LPL. The LPL Week 1 recap went out yesterday. You can check that out if you haven't, and of course, the LTA Primer is going to be coming out later this week. So much content coming to this channel. You're definitely going to want to stick around for it, and hit that subscribe button, hit that bell, so you can be notified when those videos do go live. But of course, with all that being said, I hope you all are having a great day. I hope you continue to have a great day, and I will see you all later.